to share the highlights from each of the 13 books that I read in December and reveal which ones you need to add to your reading list. As usual, I'll be giving the books I read in the order from the ones I liked least to the ones that I liked best. So I did not have any one-star books in December, but I did have one 2-star book, and that was To Claim a King by May Sage. And this is a novella that follows Xandri, a human woman who somehow ends up in a tournament with dragon females to become the next dragon queen. It is the first book in the Age of Gold series, which is a series of what seems to be standalone fantasy novels set in the same world. And this is not the first May Sage book that I have read. I've read another one of hers that I did end up giving 4 stars in one of her other series. And I think one of the reasons why I gave this one such a low rating is for a couple of reasons. I think I really discovered in 2024 that fated mates is just not a trope that I enjoy about 90% of the time. I have been known to enjoy a fated mates book here or there depending on how it's done and how much agency I feel like the characters have outside of that fated bond. But yeah, I think I've just been discovering that I don't love the fated mates trope. However, I am going to give the world building some credit here because our hero is a dragon. And one of the things that I found interesting is how May explains dragon hoarding in this universe, that it is almost like a kind of dementia as a dragon gets older, that they start becoming more and more obsessed with their gold and their hoard. And I thought that was like a really interesting world building point to add. I had 2 3-star books in December that I read. The first one being The Governess Affair by Courtney Milan. And this is a prequel novella for the Brother Sinister series by Courtney Milan. And it follows a governess, Serena, who is let go from her position after she is put into a compromising situation by a lord. And she goes to this duke to try to demand the care that she needs as she is pregnant with his child. But she comes across the Wolf of Claremont, who is kind of like this duke's right-hand man because he made a big bet saying, I can get your finances in order, and if I do so, you'll give me 500 pounds. So naturally, the Duke charges the Wolf of Claremont, whose name is Hugo, with getting rid of Serena, and through the course of this event, they end up falling in love. I gave this book 3 stars because while it was cute, I ultimately just didn't connect with the characters. I will say they had really good banter though. And romance in shorter form for me is just a little difficult in general, unless it's an established couple and we're getting kind of like a side story or an after story, which is probably why I enjoy fanfic so much. But otherwise, it tends to just come off very much like insta-love, and that's never going to be something that I enjoy. The next book on my 3-star list is Snowblind by Ragnar Jonasson. This is book 1 in the Dark Iceland series, and this follows Arithur, who is a rookie policeman who gets stationed in a small town in the north of Iceland. And he's told that nothing ever really happens in this small town, but when a famous author falls to his death, and it looks kind of suspicious, and when a woman is found bleeding to death half naked in the snow, well, maybe it's not quite as quiet of a town as he believes. So this book was recommended as one of Jennifer Love's Book's favorite mystery novel series. I don't think she quoted this book specifically, but she definitely made a reference to this series, and me being the completionist that I am, I had to start with book 1. I really enjoyed this novel. I liked getting to know this kind of sleepy Icelandic town and the villagers inside it. Although I will say it did hit a few of my relationship icks in this book in particular. And while the mystery to me was interesting and I feel like it was well developed, that wasn't what really engaged me in the story. What really got me into the story are the characters in this small town. So I definitely think I'll be continuing this series for now. Not me forgetting to use my external mic once again. Oops. I'm sorry. I don't want to go back and refilm what I've already filmed, so we're just going to move on from here. I had 6 books that I put in my 4-star category for this month, and the first of these books is Faster Than Normal by Peter Shankman, which is a kind of self-help book about how to harness the strengths of having ADHD to be more productive. This book has a lot of practical advice on how to harness ADHD hyperfocus to be more productive. Things that, as someone who was late diagnosed with ADHD, I realized that I had already kind of put into place as coping mechanisms for myself in the past. Although I will say those things do work for me. I feel like this book is still kind of ableist. And that's a problem that I have with most productivity books. I liked the concept of harnessing the strengths of ADHD because, yes, there are strengths to having ADHD, but there are also a lot of drawbacks, and to completely ignore those doesn't do any service to the conversation. And that's why I could only give it 4 stars, even though the advice he gives about staying more productive does work. Next up, we have Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent, which is the first book in the War of Hearts series. And this book follows Tisana, who was basically sold into slavery as a child when her kingdom was overthrown, and manages to escape as an adult. However, in order to escape, she had to leave behind her best friend. So in order to save her best friend, she goes to the Orders, which is like a magical organization. And they accept her as an apprentice because she does have magical abilities. And she is assigned as an apprentice to a fire wielder named Maximilius? Maxantarius. Sorry, I was like, it's Roman sounding. And of course, through the series of this, there's a lot of political intrigue. She and Max start kind of having a thing. But in order to save her people, Tisana makes a pretty dangerous deal with the Order. And that's going to have really lasting consequences for the rest of the series. One of the things that struck me about the characters, just from like a physical perspective, is that our main character has vitiligo, which is something I haven't read in a book before, and I thought was pretty cool. It's not called vitiligo, but the way it's described, it's vitiligo. And then also, I really liked Max as a character. He's pretty standoffish at first, but he really kind of grows on you throughout the series. Although I will say I ended up giving it only 4 stars because, you know, it's been a couple weeks since I finished this book. I don't actually remember that much about it now in retrospect. I do remember the romance being good with a nice slow buildup. And I will say I did think this book was just going to be another special girl with a forbidden power type book. And it was not that. And what the power really is honestly pretty terrifying and definitely has me interested in continuing to book 2. Another 4-star book that I read in December was The Wedding Date Disaster by Avery Flynn. This is book 1 in the Dating Disasters series. This book follows Hadley Donovan, who is a kind of charity fundraiser event planner who has to go home to Nebraska to her sister's wedding. And luckily, while she was dreading going to this wedding alone, her best friend said that he would go with her. But when her best friend gets food poisoning, it's his twin brother who steps off the plane. Let's just say her relationship with Will Holt is not the same one that she has with his brother. I really enjoyed this book. I mean, it's fake dating and enemies to lovers, so what's not to love about it? The tension between these two characters was really palpable, and I really like how they addressed the twin issue that, you know, she's best friends with the one twin, but she's not attracted to him, even though he looks exactly the same as the guy that she is attracted to. Though I will say the reason it's 4 stars and not 5 is because Will spends the majority of the book thinking that she is a gold digger who is after his twin brother. And that's the kind of like enemies part. That's why he treats her so badly. And I just found that kind of ick. It makes sense because of how they explain why he's thinking that way, and he does have a character arc about addressing that, but it still was just like, ooh, I didn't like it. So that's why I gave it 4 stars and not 5. And next up, we have a book that I've been working on a couple streams, if you ever join my live streams, and that is The Secrets That You Keep by Chloe I. Miller. This is book 1 in the Haven House series, and it is wild. And while we follow a couple different women who end up living at Haven House, our main protagonist is Evangeline Eddins, or Evie, and she is kind of the adopted daughter of this prevalent family. But the Haven House itself is kind of the place where this affluent family's secrets live. So when someone breaks into Haven House, an FBI agent comes to investigate because this may have connections to several serial murders that he has been investigating. So everybody at the house is trying to keep all their secrets, including the fact that Evie maybe has some strange relationship with one of her stepbrothers. I will say, just based on the opening chapter, I was gripped right away. I was like, ooh, like this is a serial killer thriller. I knew nothing about this book going into it, but I do enjoy a good serial killer thriller. However, as I got into reading it more, I realized that I couldn't quite figure out what this book was. Was I reading a romance? Was I reading a serial killer thriller? Turns out I was reading a bit of both. If I look at it from a romance perspective, the first book is a good romance. But I will say the first book does not answer enough of the serial killer plotline at all. The first book is mostly just about establishing Evie's romance with this stepbrother, who's not really her stepbrother because their parents never actually got married, but his father has essentially like guardianship over Evie because they did have a daughter that is their half sister. And if I could tell you the first quarter of the book, I was going, aren't these two related? And then had to go and check the family tree at the beginning of the page. That should just give you an idea of how kind of convoluted the family dynamics are in this book. Still a very enjoyable read, though. I wanted to keep reading. It definitely kept your attention, which is why I did end up giving it 4 stars. The next book in my 4-star books is Witch's Sin by Daniel B. Green, which is the first book in the Neon Ghost series. This book follows Taya, who is kind of a bounty hunter in a very futuristic world that has very cyberpunk vibes, and she has been charged with finding a missing girl. But as she investigates, she realizes that this case is much bigger than she initially anticipated, and it leads her into the den of what she never really could have expected or believed was true. I really enjoyed this book. It has really interesting world building, and I can say it is truly speculative fiction because it really crosses the line between science fiction and fantasy in the world building. I kind of equate it with kind of futuristic fantasy, so think like Star Wars, but with more cyberpunk vibes than Star Wars vibes, if that makes sense. It took me a while to really get into this book, but once I did, I was ready to turn the next page as I kept reading. I'd say it's got a bit of a slow start, but definitely picks up the more you read. And one of the real strengths of this, aside from the world building, is the characters. I sometimes really struggle with characters in big chunky books like this. And I found all of them to be really likable and interesting. And I was invested in all of their stories. And of course, I was invested in Taya's story the most. So I will definitely be reading the second book when it comes out. Please let it come out soon-ish. And the last book from December on my 4-star list is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This is book 1 in the Emily Wilde series. As you may notice, I have a problem with starting series and not finishing them. And this follows Emily Wilde who is studying the habits of fairies because she wants to, as the title implies, create an encyclopedia of fairies. And she goes to this small, wintry town to investigate some happenings that are occurring in the fair folk of that area. And she ends up being accompanied by her academic rival, Bamblebee. And I really did think this was a very cute, cozy, wintry feel, but the stakes for the climax, they did actually have legitimate stakes, especially for Emily. And while I found the plot interesting, I'll be honest, I kind of zoned out a couple times while I was listening to it. I don't know if I just wasn't in the headspace for it, but I would find that my brain would kind of go somewhere else and then be like, oh, what's happening? Oh, okay. And kind of go back and forth between it. So it did have a little bit of trouble keeping my attention. That being said, I love Emily and Bamblebee as characters, and I love how their romance plays out. It's so sweet and funny. So if you're interested in like fairy cozy vibes with a reverse Grumpy Sunshine romance, give this book a try. And now we're headed into my 5-star books. So I'll admit, I do tend to give out 5 stars a fair amount. If I want to own a copy of the book so that I can reread it in the future, I'm gonna give it 5 stars. And so this month, I ended up with 4 books on my 5-star list. The first of which was A Warning About Swans by R.M. Romero. Hilda is a daughter of Odin who is given a cloak that can transform her into a swan. And what makes her different from all of her other sisters is that she is capable of guiding souls into the afterlife. However, this is not exactly a job that she wants. So when she meets the young Baron Maximilian von Richter, she goes with him when he gives her an offer of what it might be like to become a human woman for real. But it's no surprise that she struggles to fit in with the court life in the human world. And when she sits for a portrait by the non-binary painter Mendelssohn, the painter paints her with swan wings. And she'll have to decide if she wants to stay in the human world or go back to the world of the gods. I thought this fairy tale retelling was really interesting and pretty much unlike a lot of fairy tale retellings I've read up until this point. I love the addition of like the Norse flair in this Bavarian story, and my board game geek was very happy at the mention of King Ludwig and the castles that he keeps building and not finishing, because if you are in the board game community, one of the best games out there is the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, where you are literally building a castle to maximize your victory points. So my board game geek was just pretty happy with this book. Also, I can say this book helped channel my feminine rage, as it's a story about a man who claims to love our main character, but really only loves her for the things that she can do for him. And that's why I gave it 5 stars. After that was The Love of My Afterlife by Christy Greenwood. When Delphi dies by choking on a microwavable burger, she ends up in the afterlife. In the waiting room, she meets her soulmate. But when it turns out her soulmate didn't die and that was just a near-death experience and gets sent back to the mortal world, Delphi makes a deal to go after him. I was surprised by this book. This is normally a trope that I don't particularly enjoy, but this had a lot more to it than your typical I'm gonna return from the afterlife to fix things. This book is primarily a romance and has lots of antics that are ridiculous and funny, but it also has a lot of heart. It's kind of enemies to lover, but more just like strangers to friends to lovers story that really embraces the idea that a person can have more than one soulmate. How the plot wraps up is a little bit devastating, but it's also really great and won't leave you like crying in your tissues for like ages. I normally hate the kind of third act conflict that they pull, but it worked for this story, so bear that in mind. It happened. I have finally read my first Brandon Sanderson novel, and that was Elantris. Elantris was at one point the capital of Erelon, and it was filled with benevolent beings who had magical powers. But 10 years ago, something happened and that power was corrupted. And when Princess Serene arrives in Teod to marry Prince Raoden, she finds out that he is dead. However, the marriage contract is still valid. Her country Teod and Raoden's country Erelon are under threat from an outsiding invading force trying to get everybody to convert to a particular religion. And Hrathen has come to Erelon to convert the kingdom to his god. However, while Serene thinks that Raoden has died, turns out he's actually been exiled to Elantris. And as he helps the poor people trapped in that city, he begins to unravel a series of events that will change his country forever. So yes, my first Brandon Sanderson, and I will say he is as good at world building as everybody says that he is. The political intrigue was top-notch in this book, and the romance subplot was cute and had a good payoff. I think the reason this wasn't my favorite book of the month is actually how I read it, which I read the graphic audio adaptation. And while I loved the cast, the thing I have to notice about graphic audio, and this is my first graphic audio book that I've really listened to, is that they need to balance their sound effects. Because there are times where the background noise was so loud that I couldn't hear the narration of the book. So I had to kind of fill in the holes or listen really, really closely to hear the narration. If they could just take down those sound effects to like half the volume on the track, I think that would fix the problem, because I didn't mind the sound effects. They were just too loud. If you made it to this point in the video, leave me a bird emoji. And my favorite book of December was The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. 5 years ago, Gita's husband disappeared, and her entire village thinks that she killed him. She didn't, but they all think it. So when things start happening in the town and the other wives of the town start coming to her to help their husbands, Gita has a little bit of a problem on her hands. So I read this book actually for my work book club, and I absolutely loved it. It's so funny, but still deals with really real issues in a way that I couldn't help but admire. The romantic interest for Gita is wonderful, and I love that the conflict between them comes from external forces. It also has some internal forces, but they do resolve those, I think, fairly quickly, and then it becomes an external issue. Overall, what I loved about this book is that it's a wonderful book about community, and particularly a community of women, and how you can lift each other up or tear each other down. And that's why it was my favorite book in December. So if you want to know what books I plan to kick off 2025 with, make sure to check out last week's video, my January TBR. I think it should be here, here, here. I don't know, it's one of these sides. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.